What is up? Okay, we're going to go ahead and take a look at Diablo 3's attributes and how they affect your character. We're going to start with the core attributes. We'll talk about damage, things like critical hit chance, attack speed. We'll talk about your options for defense, and then we'll finish up with how elemental damage affects your build. So one thing to know is that I made this during patch 2.0.4. Currently I'm sitting here and the realm is down actually. There's one thing that might change, and I'm expecting it to be one of the later points. It's probably only one thing that will change patch wise. So some of the numbers are not real. Don't worry about that, we're just simplifying it for discussion. Alright, so let's go ahead and get started. A primary attribute for a class modifies the base damage, the weapon's damage per second, by a %. This is a 1-to-1 ratio. This is modifying the base weapon damage. The damage on your character info sheet when you press the inventory button is not your damage per hit, but is the average damage you deal per second while attacking. This value is what is modified by your skill's percentages. So if you have a barbarian and you have 50 strength, that's a 50% damage increase on your weapon's damage. Other examples of attributes that affect weapon damage are critical chance, critical hit damage, attack speed, and your attack speed when dual wielding. We'll talk about these in appropriate depth. There are 4 core attributes. One of these core attributes is your primary attribute. Strength will add to every class's armor. Strength only increases damage though for barbarians and crusaders. For every 1 point of strength, you get 1 armor. This is not a % increase, it's a solid number. Dexterity increases the chance to dodge for every class, but only increases damage for monks and demon hunters. This increase in dodge chance has a diminishing returns effect. Here's a table showing this, courtesy of DiabloWiki.net. Let's move on to intelligence. This increases the resistance for all classes, but damage exclusively for wizards and witch doctors. Each point of intelligence adds 0.1 to all resistances. This is not a % increase, that's 0.1 solid number. Vitality increases the amount of life for every class. Once you hit 60 and on, each point of vitality adds 35 life. Here are the formulas. You don't really need to worry about this because you'll always be trying to get as much vitality as you want unless your build specifically needs a low life. Let's go ahead and move on to defense. We'll start with armor. We'll look at resistance, dodge, and block. So armor will reduce all damage done to a player by a %. This includes elemental damage. So raw damage that's incoming, this is going to be reduced. Here's the formula from Diablo Wiki. So M level here is the level of the monster. In ROS, the monster level of your character will be your character's levels. Every monster scales with you, which is kind of neat because it makes calculating this pretty simple. So what does this mean? So let's assume the monsters I'm fighting are level 70. If my armor is 2000, my incoming damage is reduced by 36%. At 3000, it becomes 46%. At 4,000 it becomes 53%, at 5,000 it's 58%, and at 6,000 it's 63%. As you can see, we have run into another instance of diminishing returns. So let's move on to resistance. Resistance will reduce the damage for a certain type of elemental damage, and that includes physical damage. It is similar to armor, but each point of resistance is worth 10 armor points. Here's why. Look at this formula. Notice that in the denominator of this equation, armor multiplied the monster level by 50, but resistance multiplies it by 5. Think about it like this. If we want 20% damage mitigation, we can either strive for 875 armor or 87.5 all resistance. Of course, you will have both armor and resistance acting together on your characters when you're in game, but this will help you determine whether you need more resistance or armor. We'll simplify this choice. Let's suppose a level 70 pants item can roll a maximum of 400 armor or 100 all resistance. To get the damage mitigation of 100 all resistance, the total armor of the pants would have to reach 1000. So in addition to the sheet armor on those pants, it would have to roll a rare, magic, attribute, whatever, to get it to 1000 to equal 100 all resistance. So to get better damage mitigation than choosing all resistance, the armor on those pants would have to be greater than 1000. We'll talk about dodge briefly. It's really not that important unless you're a monk. That's because there are passives and primary attributes that provide too much synergy to ignore. Since this is not a build-oriented talk, we will not be covering when you should opt for dodge as a monk. Okay, blocking. Interestingly enough, when Diablo 3 was released, a lot of barbs were using block as a way to survive in the higher difficulties. Think of blocking like absorbing a fraction of the damage you should have taken without blocking the incoming attack. One thing to note is that this only reduces the physical damage of attacks. Now you can see why barbarians were taking advantage of this. Your block amount is preset, but it can be modified by items. The same is true of your block chance, but there are often legendary helms and rare shields that roll high block chances. Be warned that you can only reach a maximum block chance of 75%, but there's not a cap on the block amount. We'll discuss damage modifiers, focusing on critical hits and elemental modifiers. Every character starts with a base critical chance of 5% and a critical damage of 50%. Attributes like critical chance, critical damage, and attack speed modify the damage that is a product of the bonuses from your primary attributes. For example, strength and our barbarian example earlier. Critical chance and critical damage modifies your damage on top of the damage that the game has already calculated for you after strength and attack speed have been taken into account. Let's say we have a base damage of 5 and our strength is at 50. Our damage after the bonus for strength is 7.5. However, when you pull up your character sheet, your damage would actually be a little bit higher than that, and that's because of critical chance and critical damage. I'm going to cover an important topic. When does a Nephilim value critical chance versus critical damage? Let's be clear, critical damage is only valuable if you are landing critical hits. The general consensus is to match every 1% of critical hit chance with 10% of critical hit damage. Okay, that's great, but let's see how you would evaluate your specific situation. You can see that you can calculate the average extra damage that you would be receiving from your critical hit stats with the formula down below. Let's use an example. Here we have a player with 6% chance to critical hit for an extra 25% critical hit damage. Using this formula, the extra damage is about 15%. Say this player finds 2 pieces of gear for the same slot. One increases critical hit damage by 10, and one increases critical hit chance by 5%. If this Nephilim wanted to get the most out of those 2 items, he or she would go with the critical hit chance in this instance. This might not be true for every instance, and that's why that 1% of critical hit chance with every 10% of critical hit damage is what we usually follow. Alright, let's move on to element damage and modifiers. Let's say you are a monk using a lightning based build. You just found a weapon that deals plus 500 to plus 700 lightning damage. You also have a pair of mage fists that give you 20% extra lightning damage. Before you're going to ask the obvious question, we're going to take a look at some things because you have to take this into account. If your weapon has lightning damage on it, but you use a skill that is of the fire element, your attack is now a fire attack. You are not doing lightning damage. This means that the extra lightning damage that you rolled on your item will do nothing for that attack in that situation, where you're using a fire skill on top of a weapon that does lightning damage. Alright, we're going to use a concrete example for a specific skill. Let's say we're using Frozen Orb, and we have an item that gives us 20% extra cold damage. This one is pretty simple. Total damage that Frozen Orb will do with the extra 20% is 240%. And you basically just multiply 120% by the 200%. Alright, let's take a little bit more complicated example. We now have 2 items, one that gives 20% extra cold damage, and one that gives 15% extra cold damage. So do these multiply, or are they additive? The answer is that they are additive. This means that the next bonus to cold damage is 35%. So now Frozen Orb does 270% damage. A smart player will value extra elemental damage combined with extra skill damage over incremental critical hit chances. Here's why. Remember when I said that elemental damage increases from items are additive? The same is not true when you're talking about extra skill damage attributes on top of extra elemental damage bonuses. Let's use the Frozen Orb example. Say we have an item that increases Frozen Orb skill damage by 20%. This will buff us to 240%, similar to earlier. And we also have gloves and bracers that give us a net 35% extra cold damage. To calculate this, increase Frozen Orb's damage by the 20% extra skill damage, and then increase that product by the 35% extra cold damage. In our example, this means that 200% damage on the Frozen Orb now became 324%. That's insane. That's a 162% increase. If it was additive, it would only be a 150% increase. Okay, let's go back to our lightning weapon and extra lightning damage example. Here's the question that we have been waiting for. Does that extra lightning damage increase the lightning damage on the weapon by 20%? Well, currently, no. It should, and Blizzard is probably working on this as I speak. If you are watching this about a month from the upload date, it is probable that the answer is now yes, and that the 20% will apply to lightning damage on your weapon. I hope this helps you in figuring out which attributes you should value over other ones after watching this video. Anyway, that's it from me. If you have any comments, positive or negative, you go ahead and leave them in the comments. Alright, I'm out.